What's up, ladies and gentlemen? I'm the Best Virginian, and today we are going to be talking about Prohibition in West Virginia, another excellent installment of West Virginia True Crime. So, shortly after the Civil War, some West Virginians started toying with the idea of prohibiting the manufacturing, buying, and selling of alcoholic beverages. As early as the 1880s, some groups were pushing this ideal, but it was mostly limited to religious and social reform groups, and very few West Virginian politicians actually supported these ideas. They argued it would lower crime, increase moral fiber, and would just lead to overall better lives for West Virginians. So time passes, and you have industrialization, the spread of the railroad to rural parts of the state, an immigration boom, and most importantly, the rise of organized labor. The year was 1912, and you had what would become known as the Paint and Cabin Creek strikes. Union members in southern West Virginia gave demands to the co-operators. In response, the operators sent out mine security and even called in private detectives to try and put down these striking union individuals. The southern part of the state essentially exploded. Parts of it had to be placed under martial law. Mother Jones showed up, started marching around, and was almost immediately thrown into jail. The whole situation just went nuts. Now, when word of the Paint and Cabin Creek strike started to spread, operators in the other part of the state started thinking if it could happen in Paint and Cabin Creeks, it could basically happen anywhere in the state. And they thought, well, maybe poor people shouldn't be allowed to drink. So they essentially went to the Capitol and started lobbying and throwing money around to push this idea of prohibition. So they went to Charleston and they started lobbying pretty hardcorely, but they said they were doing it to promote safer and more productive workers. Oddly enough, unions actually opposed prohibition. They saw it as a way for management to try and control workers off company time, which adds a really weird overarching element to the entirety of the Southern Cold Wars. At the same time, the Klan was pushing that real Americans didn't drink alcohol, even though a good chunk of the founding fathers of the United States actually brewed their own beer. The Klan pushed this agenda that real Americans didn't need alcohol, and they really pushed for prohibition, and this formed kind of an unholy alliance of xenophobia and elitism that ultimately would get prohibition put to a vote. In November 1912, 69% of West Virginians that voted were in favor of statewide prohibition. Immediately, some West Virginians sought out ways to make their own booze. Wine, moonshine, homebrew beer, gin, hard cider, Canadian ale, and malt liquor were all on the tab for alcohols that West Virginians could just brew themselves. But the best hustle from this time period was done by the Raymond Lager Company of Wheeling. See, Ohio County, where Wheeling is located, overwhelmingly was against prohibition, mostly due to the Raymond Lager Company, one of West Virginia's largest beer manufacturers. Whenever the law came down that alcohol would eventually be illegal in the state of West Virginia, the Raymond Lager Company decided, here's what we're going to do. We're going to rent a bunch of warehouse space in Ohio. We're going to rev up production for the next 18 months or so. And then, if people choose to go to Ohio to buy alcohol, that's their problem. Not our problem, because, to be honest, the Raymond Lager Company was too busy counting money for it to be their problem. Even though the law was passed in 1912, it did not go into effect until July 1st, 1914. Immediately, West Virginian politicians saw that the law really would be of no use if they couldn't enforce it, so they went out immediately to try and find someone with the experience and the grit and the know-how to really enforce these prohibition laws. Enter an individual named Fred O. Blue, the state tax commissioner, and he was put in charge of enforcing these prohibition laws. His job in previous years had been to assign values to personal property and make sure people were paying taxes on said property. He had zero experience in law enforcement. But Fredo Blue was still put in charge of prosecuting anyone manufacturing, buying, selling, or soliciting the buying or selling of alcohol. And his revenuers became known as the Blue Men. At a time period when West Virginians weren't afraid to take up arms against mine thugs and private detectives, you have these revenuers that were coming around looking to arrest and prosecute anyone buying, selling, or manufacturing alcohol. And you can probably see how well that worked out. West Virginians weren't afraid to fight back. In fact, across 13 years, at least a dozen West Virginia revenuers were killed in the line of duty. Now, when you think of prohibition and moonshiners and bootleggers and gin runners, you probably think of the Dukes of Hazzard or some Public Lambert type character, big, hilariously large clay jug. You probably don't think of like mobsters, Al Capone types, but West Virginia did have those too. When the West Virginia boom in immigration occurred, especially during World War I, when lots of people were needed to mine lots of coal, to make lots of steel, to build things like tanks and ships and guns, Italian and Grecian immigrants were coming over in very high numbers to take up these abundant coal mining jobs. Now, as normal Italians and Grecians and other individuals settled in really across the Appalachians, but specifically in the northern Panhandle and north central West Virginia, little groups of organized crime followed them. Now, these groups expected to just be able to set up rackets like they had in the old world and extort money out of people. And like we just got done saying, during a time period when West Virginians weren't afraid to take up arms against mine thugs and private detectives and revenuers, whenever the mobsters came around expecting to just be able to extort money out of people, they fought back. After years of feuding with locals, Detective John C. McKinney broke the case and some 8 mobsters were arrested in connection to the murder of Frank Naples. This was in north central West Virginia. I think specifically Harrison County, but there were some overlap with some other communities. 4 of these individuals were eventually found guilty and executed at the Moundsville State Penitentiary. And I don't know why, but I do believe every single West Virginia true crime I have done so far has ended with someone dying at the penitentiary. It's like the Arkham Asylum of West Virginia. And I make that analogy in the one episode that I don't have a Batman coffee mug. Why would I do that? Now, over the years, several people have questioned me that if there was such an organized crime presence in West Virginia during this time period, why aren't there more accounts of it? And the short answer is, besides the code of secrecy that a lot of these communities where these mobsters thrived in, besides that, you also have coal wars, a time period when bombings, assaults, shootings, arsons, and murders were already weekly occurrences, if not sometimes daily occurrences. We had a Capitol building that was destroyed under questionable circumstances, the Matewan Massacre, the Battle of Blair Mountain, the Cliftonville Riot. Crime and violence got so far out of hand that West Virginia had to form the State Police Department and remuster the West Virginia National Guard. with all these acts of violence, if a handful of instances a year are linked to organized crime, how would you even be able to tell? And secondly, how many of these instances were just because people wanted to have a drink? Like, seriously, let the boys drink. Now, would the Battle of Blair Mountain would have happened if before the Matewan Massacre, Sid Hatfield could have just taken the Baldwin Felt boys back to a saloon and had a couple pitchers of beer and talked out their problems? I mean, yeah, probably the exact same thing would have happened. He probably would have been assassinated, and then, security forces would have probably have tried to continue to arrest Union individuals until an angry mob basically decided to march on Blair Mountain. But still, I mean, the situation probably wouldn't have been any worse. In 1933, West Virginia becomes the first state primarily below the Mason-Dixon line to ratify the 21st Amendment, allowing West Virginians for the first time in 19 years almost to have a drink. Today, West Virginia is home to more than 20 breweries, 17 wineries, and 14 officially licensed distilleries. I know that there's probably some of you that if I would have just said 14 distilleries would have said, no, there's way more than that. Officially licensed distilleries. So if you're planning a trip to the Mountain State, or if you're a lifelong West Virginian, don't forget to drink local. And until next time, don't forget to stay wild and stay wonderful. And I'll talk to you later. Probably should have talked about flappers at some point during this video.